Hello and welcome to the Moonraker's Tales, Wiltshire's Story, a podcast by the Wiltshire Museum. We are your hosts for this episode. I'm Tom.
And I'm Bethany. In this episode, we'll be looking into some odd and incredibly strange events that have happened within Wiltshire, including a severed hand, a tiger attack, and a man who was so tall he could light a cigarette using only a street lamp.
That's right, these stories are real life, but they are a bit weird. Our first story is based in the city of Salisbury, in a pub that dates back to 1320.
This is the story of the haunch of venison's severed hand.
Picture this. It's the 1820s, and the haunch of venison in Salisbury is packed full of locals. They are drinking ale, playing whist, a card game similar to bridge, which probably included gambling, and having a good time. A stranger shows up at the inn, supposedly travelling to Southampton. He catches the attention of the locals for being loud and flashy, and the attitude towards him is rather hostile. However, this changes quite quickly after the stranger offers to pay for everyone to have a drink. He also decides to join in the game of whist. The stranger won every game he played, which naturally caused the locals to grow frustrated and suspicious. After the stranger had won too many games, a local butcher, who was quite drunk, was enraged by losing once more. He grabbed his cleaver and severed the stranger's hand. It turns out that the stranger had been cheating the whole time. The hand had been thrown into the fireplace and forgotten about. It's even thought that the ghost of the stranger haunts the inn to this day. It was rediscovered in 1911 during renovations. The smoke from the fire had managed to mummify it. It had been kept on display at the Haunch of Venison until 2010, when it was stolen. A replica was displayed in its place.
Yes, and for those who are wondering, this actually exists, and there are actual people in the country who would want to steal a mummified hand, and for the record, it has been stolen multiple times.
Yes, that's right, and some people in tour groups were told that the Salisbury Museum have the hand, when in fact they don't. They don't, it's just a rumour.
No. So try not to go to Salisbury Museum and ask to see the hand, because likely is they don't have it.
And to increase security, it was locked up in a cage, but it was still stolen.
As far as I'm aware, it was iron bars, and it might have even been behind glass so people could see it. So they managed to get through not only glass, but an iron bars.
They must have been really desperate to get hold of that hand.
Not sure why, but you think it's also rather odd that the butcher happened to be carrying a cleaver on him after working hours, and that his first thought was, after finding out that he had lost a game, was to cut off a man's hand.
Then again, he was rather drunk, so theoretically he didn't really have enough consciousness to know what's going on. And besides, people in those days often carried blades with them, especially in such a place as a pub. So it makes sense that the butcher would want to defend himself with a cleaver.
Definitely, and when you think about it, it might actually have been his own cleaver, his own resources that he paid for, so rather than leave them unattended in his butcher shop where it could have been stolen, he'd rather carry his own tools on him.
That's right. And nobody really knows what happened to the stranger after that, and rumour has it that his ghost still haunts the pub to this day, although it's never really been proven.
No, I think another rumour that has also happened was that after his hand was cut off, the stranger ran away screaming, but no one really knows what happened, as you said.
And on the subject of misfortunes in pubs, let's move on to our next story. This one takes place in Malmesbury during the 1700s.
It's a story that's been immortalised in Wiltshire's history, and as a sketch within an episode of Horrible Histories, this is the tale of the Malmesbury tiger attack.
In October 1703, a travelling circus had come to Wiltshire. It was set up in the back garden of the White Lion pub in Malmesbury. The circus mainly featured a travelling zoo, which was a relatively new occurrence in England. One of the barmaids was a woman named Hannah Twinoy. She found entertainment by going to the animals and teasing them, especially the tiger. Days were spent prodding and upsetting the tiger, despite being told not to, until one day the tiger had grown frustrated. It had escaped its cage and mauled Hannah to death. She was only 33 at the time. Hannah's become immortalised as the first known person in the UK, on record that is, to have been killed by a tiger. Her story was even told in an episode of Horrible Histories in 2012.
See, there's a lot of speculation as to whether Hannah actually exists. There's no known records of her at all. Besides, even her surname, Twinoy, it's not a very common name for Wiltshire. It's very, very Welsh when you think about it.
Yes, not a very English-sounding surname at all. Her grave is also something that causes a lot of confusion, as it's not known where the funds came from. She was a woman and a barmaid, and theoretically at the time, she couldn't have been able to afford a gravestone.
That's very true, but it's very possible that it could have been gifted by the community. For example, her death was very horrific and on record the first of its kind, so it was very much could have been a peace offering to her family, as a sort of commemoration of her death.
Very true, and I think the important thing here we can all learn is that you should listen to animal handlers when they tell you not to provoke an animal.
Yes, definitely. Our third story is set in Devizes Market about 50 years later. It is likely that it's been used by parents in order to stop children from telling lies.
Ruth Pierce was a woman who paid the ultimate price for lying. This is her story. On the 25th of January 1753, 4 women decided they would buy a sack of wheat from a farmer in Devizes Marketplace. These women, Elizabeth Slade, Sarah Slade, Mary Parker and Ruth Pierce, a widow from Potton, agreed to pay 17 shillings between the 4 of them. After collecting the money, the women discovered they were short of cash. Elizabeth, Sarah and Mary had grown suspicious of Ruth, and were convinced that she was withholding her full share. Ruth was offended after being openly accused of withholding money. She allegedly denied the accusation by calling upon God as her witness, saying she would drop dead if she was lying. After repeating this a second time, Ruth promptly collapsed and died. According to the word of mouth, the missing money was concealed in her hand. A plaque telling her story has been put up on the Devizes Market cross, warning anyone else from using God's name to conceal a lie.
For those wondering, the plaque still exists, and it can in fact be found near the market car park in Devizes.
It was put up by the mayor as a warning to everyone else. At the time, lots of people were very superstitious. A lot of people were very deeply religious as well, and I think that shows, and that people were genuinely terrified and saw this as a genuine threat in the town.
Definitely. But in reality, Ruth probably had a really poorly timed heart attack or a stroke, but I guess we'll never know.
Her death was allegedly recorded as death via lying, which is quite a rare occurrence.
Yes, and in fact Ruth became a figure of public interest. Her house was even featured on postcards during the 1900s.
And now, it's time for our final story. Did you know that one of England's tallest men once lived in Wiltshire?
That's right. This is the story of Frederick Kempster, or as he's known in Wiltshire, the Scenes Giant.
Frederick was born in Bayswater, West London, in 1889, one of 7 children. At the age of 8, his father passed away. With his family living in poverty, Frederick and his 2-year-old brother George were placed into care and eventually sent off to Canada to start a new life. He returned to England and settled in Wiltshire in 1904 at 15 years old after being considered unfit to work. Some have said that he suffered a brain injury after falling from a window and cracking his head. At this point, he was suffering from problems in his knees and legs which led to his uncontrollable growth. By 1911, at the age of 22, he was over 7 foot tall. He could light a cigarette using a street lamp. He had found work as a basket maker before joining an American circus, specifically Astley & Co.'s American Circus, as a professional giant under the name of Teddy Bobs. In 1914, he went on a tour of Europe as part of a travelling circus, though his height was often exaggerated to over 8 feet tall, in order to entice more crowds. However, the same year, Frederick was in Berlin after the break of the First World War and was placed under house arrest, alongside other English members of the camp. The circus he belonged to managed to pull some strings to gain the aid of the United States Diplomatic and Consular Service in order to free Frederick, though it took a long wait for his release. Once he returned to England in 1916, he lived with his sister in Seend. He ran a local pub that he frequented. He would sit in an armchair there, and people would pay him to hear his stories. After regaining his strength from captivity, Frederick returned to the circus, likely under a different company, in 1917 and began touring England. However, while in Blackburn, he contracted the flu, which later developed into pneumonia. He sadly died in hospital in 1918 at the age of 29.
A tragic story indeed. American newspapers that were covering calls for his release often deemed him a key part of the war effort. The reason why, you ask? Because he required so much food, he was often seen as depleting the enemy's resources.
One newspaper even claimed that his breakfast was 4 loaves of bread and 6 eggs.
I can't imagine eating that food in a day, let alone for breakfast.
Exactly.
And there is no exact height for him. All sources differ, as many were often exaggerated.
Though he did feature in the Guinness Book of World Records as one of the tallest men in England from the book 1967 all the way to the book 1993.
And he also has many nicknames. He's not just the Scene Giant, but he's also known as the Blackburn Giant, the English Giant, and even the Avebury Giant.
Evidently he was so popular that everyone wanted to claim him as theirs.
And as I've seen reports referring to him as having a heart of gold, it's not hard to understand why.
And on that note, we've come to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more stories about Wiltshire's history, you can check out our other episodes and subscribe to the podcast.
We'd also like to thank our editors for all of their hard work. Thank you once again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of Moonraker's Tales, Wiltshire's Story.